Okay, hi everybody. Welcome to this headliner video for the Channel Talent session with me on the 28th of February, which is titled, Can We Control Nuclear Weapons? So, the aim of this video is to introduce you to the topics that we're going to be discussing and to just try and get you thinking critically ahead of the time about 2 or 3 key questions for the session that we're going to be addressing. So this session is going to be of interest to anybody, obviously, who's thinking about going on to study politics or international relations at university. But it will also be interesting, I think, for those who are interested more generally in history, conflict and security, or indeed if you're just kind of keeping up with international current affairs. So the background to this session, obviously, is kind of provided by the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. And this has brought up some interesting and quite urgent questions, I think, around nuclear weapons that lots of us haven't thought about for a number of years, or perhaps in your case, as school students, ever. Obviously, I mean, I was born after the Cold War ended, and I imagine most of you were as well. So I think for a lot of us, these questions have been kind of in the background for a long time, and now they're coming up again. So what I want to do is try and kind of make sense of this a little bit. Okay, so before we get into it, just a little bit of background about me and my job and where I work. So my name is Tom. That's me there. I'm a lecturer in strategy and intelligence in the Department of International Politics at Aberystwyth University. You can see a little picture of the Aberystwyth seafront there. It's a very pretty town. Aberystwyth is a very small but quite lively coastal town, university town, obviously, on the west coast of Wales, right in between the mountains and the sea. It's a very pretty place. And we have a very well-known Department of International Politics here. In fact, our Department of International Politics was the first of its kind in the world, and founded just after World War I in 1919. So we have a long kind of history and tradition of thinking about these big questions of international kind of international relations, international affairs, war and peace, all that sort of stuff. So in terms of my own research, what I work on, obviously my job, there are 2 kind of big parts of my job. One is teaching and one is research. So I research nuclear weapons and nuclear politics, the politics of nuclear weapons and technology. So when I was doing my PhD, I was focusing on South Africa and its nuclear weapons history. For those of you who weren't aware, South Africa did have a nuclear weapons program, but got rid of it in the early 1990s. So I still do a little bit about nuclear politics in Africa, but I'm also now interested in these bigger kind of abstract questions of nuclear weapons and the future of humanity, the future of the planet, and relating nuclear weapons questions to big global kind of instabilities and dynamics. Things like climate change and AI, for example, pose lots of challenges to how we think about nuclear politics. So this is where I'm kind of thinking at the moment. In terms of teaching, I teach modules on a variety of things. I do a lot of stuff on warfare and strategy and security at both the undergraduate and the postgraduate level. So I teach undergraduate, bachelor's and master's degree stuff as well. So I also run a first-year module, more general module called Behind the Headlines, which looks at news stories through the lens of international politics theory. And next year, I'm also introducing a new module for second and third year students on the use of the military in civil crises. So how do we use the military crises like COVID and climate disasters and things like this? So that's a little bit about me and what I do. So to go to the session that we're going to be running on the 28th of February, this session is going to be called Can We Control Nuclear Weapons? Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm going to sort of introduce a little bit, What do I mean by this question? And what's the background to this question? And why I want us to think about it all together. So, can we control nuclear weapons? Well, in order to sort of get into this discussion, we need to go back and think about a little bit of history. I'll start with this quote. So, John Lewis Gaddis, very famous historian, wrote a very influential book about the Cold War. This is a quote from an article that he wrote around the time. He says, "It has to be acknowledged that the statesmen of the post-1945 superpowers have, compared to their predecessors, been exceedingly cautious in risking war with one another. It seems inescapable that what has really made the difference in inducing this unaccustomed caution has been the workings of the nuclear deterrent." So what Gaddis is saying there is global leaders in the Cold War, particularly the US and Russia, or the Soviet Union at the time, have been very, very wary of risking war with one another, and that's because they have nuclear weapons. And to put it kind of more simply, more bluntly, Margaret Thatcher, who's up there, who I'm sure you'll recognise, made a very similar argument. She says, "A world without nuclear weapons would be less stable and more dangerous for all of us." Now, this obviously seems potentially a little bit contradictory. These are weapons, the most destructive weapons that humanity has ever invented, and they're capable of ending all life on Earth pretty much instantly. So how can we argue that nuclear weapons preserve peace and stability and prevent war? So the answer to this question lies in a body of thinking called nuclear deterrence theory. So again, delve into this a little bit, into the historical background. So after the end of World War II in 1945, the US and the Soviet Union, so for those of you who are less familiar, the Soviet Union, that's Russia, plus a number of smaller republics, and they're all together in the same state under communist rule of the Soviet Union. The US and the Soviet Union enter into a so-called Cold War with one another, which basically begins in 1945. And this means that they're global rivals. They're fighting out a battle between capitalism and communism, and kind of imposing their own sort of visions of their competing empires on the world, who's going to be the major global power. But it's a Cold War rather than a hot war because they're not actually at war with one another in a formal sense. So the US, of course, used nuclear weapons in Japan at the end of World War II. 4 years later, in 1949, the Soviet Union detonates its first nuclear weapon. So now our two rival superpowers in the Cold War are nuclear armed. And this is sort of potentially very dangerous, we would think, right? So in response to this, during the early Cold War, we have a US thinker called Bernard Brodie. That's that guy there in that picture. And he's historically considered one of the fathers, so-called fathers of nuclear deterrence theory. And he argues, actually, so the purpose of military strategy should ultimately be to prevent wars and to not have to fight them. So the ideal kind of military strategic outcome is that we don't go to war. And so responding to the advent of nuclear weapons, Bernard Brodie and many of his colleagues start to say, hang on, nuclear weapons could help us in this task. They could potentially prevent military aggression. Is that no possible military victory, no matter how great, could be worth the destruction that the attacking country would suffer through a nuclear retaliation. So let's put this more simply in concrete terms with an example. So say, for example, the Soviet Union wants to capture West Berlin, which they would have liked to have done during the Cold War. Would the Soviet Union have risked militarily invading West Berlin with their tanks, knowing that the US and its allies in NATO can attack it in response and potentially with nuclear weapons there? Would capturing West Berlin be worth that massive gamble? Because if NATO attacks, the Soviet Union with nuclear weapons, of course, that is very, very destructive, and it outweighs any benefits of, rolling into Berlin and capturing Berlin with your tanks. That's the theory. So if we follow this logic, we see how nuclear weapons can be considered to be potentially a force for peace. If both the US and the Soviet Union are afraid of destruction, then neither is going to dare to attack the other with either conventional or nuclear weapons. So this is the argument that Gaddis and Thatcher back there are making. And the argument goes that this is why the Soviet Union did not try to take over Europe in an armed invasion during the Cold War. There's a very famous strategic thinker called Kenneth Waltz, and he notes, there is no war in Europe during the Cold War. Nuclear weapons instead, because Europe was such a flashpoint and so dangerous, the fact that the US and the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons meant that any conflict was kind of displaced to the periphery, to the global sort of margins. So what this means is that the Cold War was not peaceful everywhere at all. Of course, there were lots of wars, lots of smaller conflicts. You had Korea, Vietnam, conflicts all across parts of Asia and Southern Africa and Latin and South America in particular. And these are still pretty destructive big wars. But in many cases, they're proxy conflicts. So that means opposing sides in the war are kind of supported by the Soviet Union on one side and the Western allies and the US on the other. And so the US and the USSR are kind of involved in these wars, but they're at one step removed. So that basically means you have wars like Vietnam, and the US is fighting Vietnam. And of course, that's part of this broader sort of struggle against communism. But it's not a direct confrontation between the US and the USSR, Soviet Russia, right? It's a proxy war. They're slightly removed because it's too dangerous for the US and the Soviet Union to have a direct confrontation. This is the theory. And the theory sort of says, ultimately, it was nuclear weapons. The fact that both sides had nuclear weapons, this actually stopped the US and the USSR from fighting over Western Europe, because that was the big flashpoint. And that ultimately kind of kept the world safe from a bigger, more kind of huge sort of strategic conflict. That's the historical background, and that's the argument. And what I'm going to get into in our main session on the 28th of February is why things just might be a little bit more complicated than this. So, nuclear deterrence theory is, as the name suggests, it's just a theory. It's possible to see things from another angle. And I think that the war in Ukraine has brought these questions back to our attention. If we can be so certain about the power of nuclear deterrence to safeguard peace and to prevent war, then why exactly has the conflict between Russia and Ukraine provoked so much anxiety? I'm sure you've all seen lots of kind of scary headlines like this, lots of probably overcooked reporting about, how we're on the brink of World War III and things like this. Now, I don't think that it's quite that serious, but certainly we're in a dangerous moment globally. And as I said, I think people are now more afraid or more aware of the danger of nuclear weapons. So that's what I want to use this opportunity to dig a bit deeper into these questions. We're also going to think about, if we have some time, the UK's own role within this. So within the UK, within Britain, the UK has its own nuclear weapon system, its own nuclear deterrent, the Trident system, which is submarine-based. So we can also think about, what does this do for us? Does the UK having nuclear weapons, does this make us safer? That's something that we're going to try and get into as well. But the big question is, can we control nuclear weapons? That's the title of the session. And I think that is the key question, what it all boils down to. The major problem with deterrence theory, which we're going to explore in more detail, is that it relies on everybody in that deterrence relationship. So the country's leaders and their advisors and their intelligence services, all of those decision makers. We kind of, if we're relying on nuclear deterrence, we're sort of relying on the idea that all of these people are fully rational and that they have all of the most accurate information that they need to make their decisions. So what happens then if leaders make bad decisions? Or what happens if things go wrong and systems, computer systems or weapon systems fail? We'll explore the long history of nuclear, quote-unquote, near misses and what this means for deterrence theory. And we'll probably end up by thinking about the idea of nuclear disarmament, okay? If we decide that we don't want to have nuclear weapons, that this is too dangerous, how do we get there? So before the session, there are 3 questions I'd like you to sort of take away and just think about, form some of your own kind of ideas about this. We'll revisit these during the session. Obviously, I'll be very interested to hear any thoughts. So the first one is, do nuclear weapons keep the peace? This claim that the Cold War stayed cold because of the presence of nuclear weapons. Is this true? Another question we can ask is, of course, can we control nuclear weapons? Can we be sure that nuclear weapons will only be used in extreme circumstances? Can we be confident that somebody's not going to make a bad decision and accidentally trigger a big nuclear war? And finally, should we aim for global nuclear disarmament? What would that look like? Now, these are massive questions. They're huge questions, and we're certainly not going to come up with any final answers in this short session. But I hope they inspire you to explore this big global issue. And of course, these are some of the big global issues that you can start to think about, hopefully in your own university studies as well. If we have time, I'll tell you a little bit about what I think on some of these questions. So I hope this has been an interesting introduction for you in this headline video. The full session is going to be held on the 28th of February, 1 o'clock to 1:45. And of course, that's going to be an opportunity for you to engage a little bit further with some of these themes and debates. So if you are interested in joining us, please register, and I hope to see you there. Okay, great. Thank you very much.